Good afternoon. My name is Mehdi Khalaji. I'm a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. On behalf of the Institute, I welcome and thank all of you for coming to this event, which is on Iran's disinformation against religious minorities. The question of religious freedom is an old question in Iran, and it goes back to when religion became the ideology of the government, at least since Safavid dynasty. But in last 40 years, it became a more crucial issue because we are facing an ideological government which makes religion a political tool to suppress its opponents. Obviously, the religious minorities in Iran are multiple, and they suffer from various issues, and each one has its own set of problems which might be different from others. We have Baha'i minorities, we have Jewish minority, Christian evangelical minority, Dervishes, Sufis, and others. But in this event, we are focusing on the problem of spreading disinformation against religious minorities, and we focus on two major minorities, which are Baha'is and Sufis. We know very well how Islamic Republic is using advanced technology to spread disinformation, not only through its mainstream media, but also through social media and internet. And we are honored today to have three great experts on these issues to discuss this issue further. Hamid Gharagozloo is the representative of the International Organization to Preserve Human Rights. Azadeh Pourzand is an independent human rights researcher and executive editor for Siamak Pourzand Foundation, which is dedicated to promoting freedom of expression. And finally, Simin Kargar, a researcher on human rights and technology, is an affiliate of Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University, where she focuses on hate speech online and the interplay of social media and power. I would like to invite our first speaker to start. Thank you.
Thank you for the introduction. It's a privilege to be here, and I hope this is one of many more events to come on a much needed subject. We all know that the regime in Iran rejects and doesn't allow any ideology or school of thought that seems to be a threat to its existence. And that's why over the past 40 years they have so viciously and forcefully oppressed every group in Iran. And the question is not whether you're Muslim or Shia, as it's evident by the plight of Sunnis in Iran, Ghanabadi Sufis who are Shia Muslims in Iran. The question is the threat to their base, to their support among the population, and specifically Basijis and Sepahis. And that's why the theoreticians of the regime early on, like Mr. Saeed Emami, pronounced that Ghanabadi Sufis are the only real existential threat to the regime because their ideology, their worldview, their practice of Islam threatens what the regime preaches as Islam, as Shia Islam. He was worried about the defection among Basijis and Sepahis, the general public having questions about the differences between what Ghanabadis practice as Shia Islam and what the regime preaches as Shia Islam. And they early on decided to eradicate Gonabadi Sufis from Iran completely. In the early days of the revolution, they burnt down their place of worship in Tehran, and it continues today. And they used three instruments to achieve this goal. One is the use of Basij to instigate extreme violence against Gonabadi Sufis. They're trained by Mehdi Taeb and his Ammariyun institution, which is a terrorist organization, indoctrinating and brainwashing young Basijis, turning them into zombies capable of extreme violence. Basically automatons that follow orders and apply extreme pressure and violence against anybody. Then the other instrument of the regime has been the corrupt judiciary system, which has consistently over the past 40 years issued judgments against Sufis and every other group, as a matter of fact. And the third, under the guidance and leadership of Hossein Taeb, who runs a secret parallel government, the information service of the Revolutionary Guards. And within that institution, there is Edare Feraq ve Adyan, or the Institute to Study Religions and Religious Groups, with vast resources. They have presence in every level of social media, from print to radio, TV, to social media platforms such as internet websites, Telegram, Instagram, Twitter, you name it. And there are many layers to this propaganda machine. The first group, or the first layer, is in charge of outright attacks on Gonabadi Sufis, and they use decrees by ayatollahs or marajeh taqlid against Gonabadi Sufis. For example, a seemingly ordinary citizen poses questions to these ayatollahs, asking about Gonabadi Sufis, whether they're legitimate, whether they're Muslims, whether they're Shia, whether dealing with them, associating with them, or marrying a Gonabadi Sufi is allowed. And of course, you can imagine the responses from these ayatollahs. And that becomes a basis and foundation for their attacks and smear campaigns against Gonabadi Sufis. And the consistent theme has been that we are an invention of the West, agents of the West and foreign powers to overthrow the regime, colluding with Baha'is, converts to Christianity, you name it. Then the second layer poses as independent, unbiased, objective observers. So they approve some aspects of Gonabadi Sufis and they criticize the rest. And their motive and objective is to create doubts and fraction within the general public about Gonabadi Sufis. The third group poses as sympathizers of Gonabadi Sufis, reinforcing the objectives of the second group. So they acknowledge that Sufis are Shia Muslims, they're citizens of the country, they should have their rights, but at the same time they criticize Gonabadi Sufis on many aspects, which is in line with the objectives of the regime. And they also have people posing as Gonabadi Sufis, supporting seemingly the objectives of Gonabadi Sufis. But they only advance the objectives of the regime and their agents that have infiltrated the Gonabadi Sufi community, and promoting them among the Sufis, creating rifts and divisions and conflict within the Sufi community. And finally, they have a team dedicated to discrediting Dr. Sayyid Mustafa Azmayesh, who started the International Organization to Preserve Human Rights, and the organization itself. They constantly criticize our activities. They regularly accuse us of being agents of the Western powers, foreign powers, colluding with, again, world Zionism, Jews, Baha'is, basically the same thing. And these efforts, massive costly efforts, ironically, have been working against the regime. They have had an opposite effect. The more they oppress Ghanabadi Sufis, the more the general public, both inside and outside of Iran, because of the work that we do, becomes aware of their plight, aware of their ideology and their worldview, practice of Islam. And they contrast that with what the regime preaches, and ultimately side with Ghanabadi Sufis and condemn the atrocities levied against them. And that's why over the past few years they have this propaganda machine has turned its attention targeting Basijis and Sepahis to prevent further erosion and defection among them. Over the past 40 years, hundreds of thousands of them have had issues with their superiors. They have parted ways with Sepah and Basij. Many of them have joined Ghanabadi Sufis. And that's a cause for concern. Basically, Saeed Emami's prediction has come true. Then, about 2 years ago, they planned a vicious plot against Sufis to brand them as terrorist groups, violent, akin to ISIS and Daesh. They surrounded Dr. Nur Ali Tabande, the spiritual leader of the Ghanabadi Sufis, surrounded his house with security agents and threatened to arrest him. And of course, Sufis congregated around his house to prevent such a thing. And then a Basiji by the name of Haddadian ran a bus through the security forces, sacrificing their own agents, killing 5 policemen and Basijis. And they tried to frame and pin this on Ghanabadi Sufis, Sufi by the name of Muhammad Yavar Salas, who was tried and hanged for this accusation. And again, it created an uproar at international level. State Department, European Commission, everybody condemned these actions. And it was proven that Mr. Salas was not the driver of the bus. There are clips and films of the event by the local people that shows the driver is a young person with black curly hair, full beard, and Mr. Yavar Salas didn't have a beard, and he had a balding head, and he was an older gentleman. And at the time, he was lying half dead in an interrogation office somewhere else in Tehran. This was a very costly mistake for them. Then they changed their strategy. Since then, they have held Dr. Nur Ali Tabande under house arrest. Basically, he's a prisoner in his home. Every aspect of his life controlled by the agents of the regime. He cannot have communication with Sufis without their permission, or Sufis access to him. They have withheld medical care from Dr. Tabande, who's 92 years old. We have evidence that he has been repeatedly drugged and poisoned with the ultimate goal of replacing him with one of their agents. And again, this propaganda machine has played a pivotal role by fabricating statements and documents in the name of Dr. Tabande, assigning one of their agents, the regime's agents, as his successor, denying the fact that he's been under house arrest and a prisoner in his home. And again, through the massive efforts of Sufis in Iran and international organizations to preserve human rights, we have provided evidence to the international community to the contrary. The stalemate continues. He's still under house arrest, his life in danger, this brief history shows the role of the Basiji judiciary and the intelligence service of Revolutionary Guard, and this propaganda machine working in concert and harmony with each other to oppress not just Ghanabadi Sufis, everybody. The same accusations are levied against Baha'is, Jews, the Kurdish people, the regular murder of the Kurdish laborers, the oppression of Arab Iranians. These are facts of life that we're dealing with.
Thank you. Thank you. So when I was invited to be on this panel, I thought a lot about what disinformation in general has meant to me growing up as a child in Iran, and then later on as an adult, and then becoming a human rights advocate, and finally someone who specializes in the rights of ethnic groups and religious minorities. And I actually had fun thinking about the peculiarity of disinformation and the narratives that the state had managed to instill in our daily lives in very bizarre ways. And I think it's important to acknowledge, at least for me, that I have also been the consumer of the disinformation in my own homeland, in my own country, growing up. And so I have a couple of anecdotes to open with, just to lighten up a little bit also the environment on such a difficult topic. I remember that, and I think people probably in my generation remember that in Tehran at least, when you would go to restaurants, if the restaurants were owned by religious minorities, they had to have a tag, like exactly where the window is to show open or close, to put a tag that said "Aqaliyat-hay mazhabi" or religious minorities. For me, it meant good pizza, and it meant really great sandwiches, because they were usually run by Armenians. And I really preferred pizza and sandwiches to any other restaurant. And for me, it meant quality food. It meant a great occasion to go with my family and have really good food that I always wanted. It was only years later that I realized this was a very horrifying way to discriminate against small business owners. It was only years later that I realized there are people who wouldn't walk into these places because they are considered dirty and najas according to Islam. I say this with a smile because I actually find it interesting how the peculiar world that the state tries to create actually has, these unintended consequences that are actually positive. But at the same time, I want to mention that we shouldn't really undermine the impact of disinformation, even if we are talking about a country where people are quite aware, I would say, of the level of lies that they are receiving on a daily basis from the state. Another anecdote in that same regard is that I grew up with my mother and father being human rights advocates, lawyers, journalists, and I would say on a weekly basis for many years, newspapers like Kayhan, like the IRIB, the state TV would basically make programming about them and call them, you name it. I mean, anything from infidel to we had houses, right, for doing corrupt things and all of that. And a part of me secretly believed that maybe my parents are infidels. And at school, I had learned Quranic verses because that's what we were learning. And at nights, I would secretly pray for them so that they don't go to hell. I would never tell them that because I didn't want to break their hearts. And I think when we think about disinformation and the impact of it, I think we really should think about children, first of all, not adults. And we shouldn't undermine the impact of it. So with this in mind, my talk today is focused on the Baha'i community, on the Baha'is of Iran, and I would like to emphasize that as a person who is not a Baha'i and a friend of the Baha'is and has had the pleasure of working with the Baha'is, and as someone who has gone through layers of discrimination as a person who belonged to a secular Shia family, I will never be able to say that I can even remotely understand what the minorities of Iran, the ethnic groups and the religious minorities, and in particular the Baha'is, have gone through. It is true we're talking about a country that disrespects and violates the rights of its citizens, regardless of whether they're majority or minority. But I think from the past 5 years of working on these issues, I say with all the humility, no matter how much we have experienced imprisonment and injustice, it's for me, it's not even remotely close to what an ordinary Baha'i girl or boy today experiences in Iran, or a Kurdish person, or a Gonabadi Dervish. So I just want to say that I have only tried to understand. I can't say that I have lived it. The Baha'is in Iran, they constitute the largest non-Muslim religious minority, and they're severely and systematically discriminated in the country. In general, religious minorities don't have unconditional constitutional rights. There are some rights reserved for them, but it's not unconditional. And the Iranian government even does not respect its own limited rights that it has regarded for its minorities. The Baha'is in particular, they are deprived from basic human rights, including access to employment and to higher education. When they have even the smallest family-owned stores, they're often closed, shut down. They are heavily persecuted. Their property is confiscated, and so on. So you can imagine essentially a daily life that wouldn't go on without intersecting with these deprivations of rights. And I have to also mention that the discriminations against the Baha'is dates prior to the Islamic Republic. However, it has become essentially much more expansive and systematic after the Islamic Republic, and in some ways even sponsored, you could call it, by the state. In terms of the specific hate campaigns and disinformation online, you can say that there's essentially an immediate campaign of defamation and hate speech against the Baha'is going on in the country. And it does have reflection outside the cyberspace. It has at times led to murder, for instance, or humiliation and so on. There are essentially four ways that, or three ways that you can categorize in terms of the ways that the Baha'is are being humiliated, attacked online by way of this disinformation. One is the economic boycotting, or the economic apartheid, essentially, which basically means that, there are different content lists going on of different Baha'i businesses, Baha'i-owned businesses that, combined with fatwas from religious figures, Islamic religious figures, asking people, basically telling people that these are not legitimate, these are najas, these are dirty, and they should be closed or they should be banned. You shouldn't go there. You shouldn't buy your whatever item it is you're buying from them. Another one is dehumanization. It's demonizing the community. It's humiliating them and accusing them of things like incest, like using incest as a way to promote the faith, to recruit, and things of this nature. And another one, which I would say is actually quite widespread for all the minorities and anybody who is at odds with the government, is this positioning you and your community against national security, against the national interest, associating you as with as an agent of the Zionist agent of Israel, or the United States, or the British, or even Russia. Usually these kinds of accusations go into very specific details and not factually oriented, but that appear as factually oriented historic narratives that it would be probably difficult for an ordinary person to be able to distinguish these facts. If you really don't deeply know the history, once they go into the history, this is especially true with the Baha'i faith, it becomes very difficult to really tell the facts from the fiction, and so they really use this technique. And just give you a couple of examples. I told you about the list, just a couple of years ago in Qatar news agency, a list was published in Zahedan, Sistan, Baluchistan, of Baha'i-owned businesses, and there was also a few fatwas, and basically encouraging people not to go to these places. This particular publication has about 2 million viewers a month. Another one is Fars news agency that has had, repeatedly content against the Baha'is. I don't even have to go into the article. I just read you the title of one, why is incest permitted in Baha'ism. I also have to say that Baha'ism is used as a way to kind of humiliate the faith. It's the Baha'i faith, and the way they usually call it Baha'ism is to make it sound like a sect. So they use the word Baha'ism a lot. And this particular farce news has 7.5 million viewers per month. And it essentially goes on. There are even content saying like, why is it permissible to steal from the Baha'is as non-Muslims? There is also something like the YouTube version of Iran, the state-sponsored IOPHR. It has 23 million users per month, and there is so much content, which especially focuses on this nationalistic sentiments of Iranians, and they have lots of content there against the Baha'is that they just keep putting on and off, highlighting things like they're associating them with colonization or the Russians, dating back to the Qajar dynasty and things like this. And then we also have this very peculiar, I would say like a newer trend, at least for me, is this seemingly secular, non-state looking, even sometimes from claiming to be from a religious minority group, individuals who come and have these ongoing YouTube kind of videos discussing the faith and attacking it and calling it many names and really trying to get into the psychology of those who are very nationalistic in an extreme way, Iranian nationalists, and sort of positioning all the religious minorities and ethnic groups, but in particular the Baha'i faith, as the biggest threat to this sense of national sentiment. And I have to tell you, it's when you watch it, it's really an odd display of hate speech and disinformation. I think that in the past few years, with the efforts that the human rights community, the civil society has done, and the Baha'i community themselves, I think we see more awareness about this level of disinformation. I think that the Iranian civil society is by far more aware of what is happening to the Baha'i community, are more willing to discuss and talk about it, essentially speak about the Baha'i. So it's not anymore as much only Baha'is talking about the Baha'i. So I consider that progress. I also think that in the specific case of the Baha'is, there is a lesson to learn, and that is, especially in a situation where we as Iranians are in such a polarized environment that we attack each other left and right, and then there are many state-sponsored, which Siamak can explain better, trollings and things going on, triggering this polarization. We fall into this narrative and we try to defend ourselves and we try to attack each other. And I think the Baha'i community for me is exemplary in that they have tried to stay away from this trap and instead have tried to raise factual awareness about their faith, about their community, humanizing it, and not in response. It's not a reaction to an action. It's independent of that. It's introducing themselves to the world. Is showing themselves as a community, as humans, as groups of people, and also at the same time documentation. I think this is very important. I think the Baha'i community has done an amazing job, which is truly exemplary and a lesson learned for the Iranian human rights community in general, not just the minority groups, that the importance of quietly documenting and objectively documenting with attention to international standards of human rights violations documentations, disinformation included. And so there is a wealth of sources, official websites, reliable data and statistics that has been gathered and compiled by them, which I think for me is what I take away when I try to think about the situation of human rights in Iran at large. I leave my talk with this and happy to engage in follow-up questions. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here to speak about Iran's disinformation and religious minorities. As my colleagues explained in great detail, religious minorities have been a target of disinformation and hate speech through both social and traditional media. This behavior has evolved and expanded throughout the recent years of digital transformation. The advance of digital technology and communication uniquely enables the high-speed spread of disinformation, rapid amplification of misleading content, and massive manipulation. Disinformation and incitement to hatred are increasingly applied as a form of information control to curb free speech, silent dissent, and influence public opinion in online public spheres. It's a matter of exerting power with the intention of disseminating false information about an individual, a group, or categories of people. In recent years, Iran, along with many other states, has weaponized hate speech and disinformation against segments of its own population in an effort to dominate online and offline discourses about sociopolitical issues. Disinformation operations have a variety of targets, including religious minorities. These targets are frequently subject to intimidation and castigation online, along with campaigns of violence, arrest, and even murder and execution offline. As Azadeh mentioned, this also includes economic repression of religious minorities as a result of the state's disinformation about these populations. An unfortunate example is the extensive campaigns in the Iranian media against Baha'is that feed a pattern of intimidation and threats against Baha'i-owned businesses in local communities, and even their closure by authorities. The consequences of technology-enabled disinformation can thus vary drastically. Additionally, these malicious attacks are often exercised in tandem with other forms of suppression. This includes state-sponsored hacking of emails or other digital communications, electronic surveillance, and distributed denial of service or DDoS attacks on opposition and minorities' websites. As a result of constant experiences with disinformation and coordinated harassment, targets tend to take more precautionary measures with information and physical security, both online and offline. Some of the individuals I interviewed throughout my research elaborated that as a result of these circumstances, they were more wary about what they chose to publicly speak or write about. And let's not forget, these attacks occur while access to information is intentionally being limited by the state through internet filtering, censorship of the press, and its monopoly over public television. So we are facing a situation that on one hand, accurate information about religious minorities is scant and access to that information limited, while on the other hand, technology-enabled platforms are being gamed or misused to disseminate falsehoods. In other words, these malicious attacks are facilitated by the same mediums that are designed to give voice to the voiceless. To complicate the situation even further, the source of these attacks is concealed. Closed groups on Telegram and encrypted messages via Facebook and Instagram are popular mediums for organizing disinformation campaigns or coordinated hate speech. But the ability of social media platforms, journalists, and researchers to track the flow of that information is low, given the privacy settings of these options. This is an area that platforms can work more closely with researchers to develop a better understanding of what is going on as this information goes underground and how to tackle the issue. Social media platforms have introduced policies, community standards, and systems to weed out disinformation, harassment, and abuse. However, it is increasingly complicated to detect state-sponsored, state-executed, state-affiliated, or state-encouraged disinformation and incitement to hatred. Adversaries evolve and improve their tactics today, while platforms target and occasionally take down the disinformation of yesterday. Ongoing community involvement can improve methods of detection of emerging threats in real time. Negligence or insufficient action from social media companies about present threats contributes to the spread of disinformation. Many of those interviewed for my research said that when a smear campaign is unfolding, they have nowhere to turn to, and they don't trust that platforms would take action about their hardship. If they were so lucky to hear back, they did not find those responses effective or sufficient. This situation is often exacerbated when the language of abuse is not English, because then platforms run into the challenge of dealing with country-specific political, social, and cultural nuances, and they're clearly not well-equipped for contextualized content moderation. Some of this is an incentive problem. Due to extensive sanctions imposed by the United States, financial transactions with Iran are prohibited in various areas, including advertising. Therefore, social media platforms do not see many opportunities for generating much revenue from the Iranian market. This may also go as far as turning a blind eye for fear of legal ramifications for servicing Iranian users. And therefore, they're not as incentivized to follow through cases of targeted disinformation campaigns, presumably because Iran as a country and many things related to it are marked as red legal flags with low priority to resolve. Ironically, Iranian influence operations that target foreign audiences, such as those in the US, have suddenly become a high priority for the same platforms as a result of public pressure and threats from the Congress. There are, however, encouraging steps taken by the major platforms to curb harmful speech and disinformation. I'm going to focus on 3 examples from YouTube, but obviously there are examples from other platforms as well. YouTube's Trusted Flagger program now has a Baha'i representative to notify the platform about content that violates their community guidelines. Additionally, YouTube has introduced policies that prohibit videos alleging that a group is superior in order to justify discrimination, segregation, or exclusion based on qualities like religion, gender, race, age, caste, sexual orientation, or veteran status. This is an effort toward limiting the spread of disinformation about minorities, as well as well-documented historical events such as the Holocaust. YouTube has also tweaked their content recommendation systems to disincentivize or downrank content that contains disinformation, conspiracy theories, or hate speech. And it is supposed to be supported by human reviews for further filtering. Although well-intentioned, this self-regulation does not go far enough. Companies cannot rely on algorithms alone, but will instead need to invest in new models of social verification too. This starts with people rather than technology. Policy responses and educational tools are required for strengthening resistance and building resilience against disinformation. A democratic and human rights-oriented response to state-sponsored information warfare must be rooted in democratic principles of transparency, accountability, and integrity. These principles should guide government policy in the battle against disinformation. So far, the EU has introduced an action plan against disinformation and pushed to work with major social media companies, although in a voluntary capacity. Google, Facebook, Twitter, Mozilla, and Microsoft have signed on to an EU's voluntary code of practice, which tries to set some standard for fighting disinformation. EU's top priorities, such as the recent European elections, have informed most of these measures. But codes of practice and platform responses must go beyond European politics and embrace the integrity and human rights of all, including religious minorities. For example, the EU should require further cooperation between platform signatories to the code of practice and fact-checkers in EU member states to debunk Iranian disinformation against dual citizens of EU member states and Iran. The United States has also dedicated resources to fact-checking civic engagement and democratic discourse both at home and abroad, including in Iran. The Global Engagement Center, or GEC for short, has been created to lead and coordinate the USG efforts to recognize, understand, expose, and counter foreign state and foreign non-state propaganda and disinformation, including by Iran. To maintain the integrity of these efforts, extensive oversight measures must be in place to hold all stakeholders involved accountable to the utmost and to avoid unfortunate situations like the recent GEC-funded Iran Disinfo project, where disinformation was responded to with distorted information. However, much of these efforts aim at disinformation that undermines or influences policies, security, or stability of the United States and its allies and partner nations, and does not necessarily human rights and domestic targets of Iranian disinformation campaigns. As Iranian disinformation campaign becomes more sophisticated, the U.S. investments must match the severity and scope of the problem. It's not an either-or situation where putting more emphasis on one refutes the need for the other. These objectives must be incorporated in GEC programming with input from experts on both sides. This can be done through appropriating more funds to build capacity of civil society, independent media, and academic researchers. That is how any such interagency can direct and coordinate policy, establish a baseline for response, and educate civil servants and create and sustain appropriate communication channels among stakeholders. And let me just wrap up by saying that there's no silver bullet for addressing the disinformation challenge. Governmental policy on its own will not be enough, nor should its efforts solely focus on disinformation targeting Western elections. The history of Iran's disinformation demonstrate that the tactics and techniques used against religious minorities and dissidents today will be used against everyone tomorrow. Tech companies, social media platforms, and civil society groups, including independent media, must be part of the solution. This means a whole-of-society approach, including Iranians themselves, is key to defending human rights and our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As a moderator, I would like to take advantage of my status and ask the first question from the panelist. Mr. Gharagozloo, you have explained how Islamic Republic is using various mechanisms to spread disinformation about Sufis and oppress them. But would you please give us some example of the government using internet to spread disinformation and actually dehumanize Sufis or excommunicate them from a Shia community? And Ms. Pourzand, I would like to ask you about the religious minorities in Iran. Other than, is there any collective efforts or any coordination between all religious minorities who are suffering from the same problems? Or in Iran, we have Baha'is are fighting for Baha'i rights, Sufis for Sufi rights, or Christian for Christian rights. So do you see that such collective effort exists? Or if it doesn't exist, what's the prospect for creating such collaboration or collective efforts? And Ms. Kargar, you have explained the situation very well in terms of Iran's using online capabilities to spread disinformation. And you said that both EU countries and US are aware of this situation and trying to somehow address this. Can you elaborate on this point and tell us few practical steps that especially US government can take to fight this disinformation campaign from Iranian government side? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Well, there are many sites. As I said, this institution under leadership of Mr. Taib has vast resources. Their websites are Adyan.net, Adyan News, Ferghe News, Dideban Center, and under each one of these there are many other sites. نقد فرق و ادیان، خبرگزاری صوفیه، روشنگری فرق و ادیان, and there is a site recently created for Mr. Mohammad Hossein Haddadian, the driver of the bus, that was sacrificed during these attacks. And in addition to that, they have a cyber army attacking our websites. They have repeatedly crashed down our websites, copied their information, sent malware or spyware to our sites and to our communication devices. So it's a lot more elaborate and extensive with vast resources than one can imagine. And they have also agents all over the world. Mansour Hosseini is in Toronto, runs the Sufia news agency. Radio Farhang in Germany and Denmark. Ali Saidi is responsible for it. Pass 224, which pretends to be to have the same objectives as Restart. Somebody named Sharar Konur Tabrizi in Nicosia in Cyprus runs Bakhtar Emruz and Iran Global. And all of these are under this umbrella of Adare Faraq Badian, the Institute to Study Religions and Religious Groups, which is part of the intelligence service of Sepah. And they have active members continually engaging with Sufis or pretending to be Sufis, as I said, to spread misinformation or cast doubt or attack the characters of Sufis and activists. And as you mentioned, I believe that there should be a coordinated and combined effort because we all have the same common enemy. And that's why we early on, under Dr. Azmehesh's guidance, decided to stand for the rights of everybody, not just Ghanabadi Sufis. We have presented members of Zarathustrians in Iran, Mandavis, Sabeis, taken them to European Parliament to present their cases. And that's the way it should be. I mean, we are all human beings. We are all children of the same God. And we should have empathy for each other and for each other's suffering, not just our own group. And I hope to see that soon. Thank you.
Thank you. So in my experience, I've seen sort of sporadic networks here and there of religious minority activists, advocates, and I also in this category include ethnic groups, particularly because many of the ethnic groups in Iran also intersect with the Sunni religious minority as well. Although they have a variety of, some of them are more secular, some of them are more religious. So I've seen here and there efforts to create networks, to coordinate efforts. This is in particular the case abroad when it comes to trying to utilize international instruments available to minorities. So I would say, for instance, the ongoing appointment of a special rapporteur on Iran has been kind of helpful to rally everyone around a mandate and to kind of try and understand how to best give information. In my experience, some groups have more capacity than others, and it's just a process and a learning process. But I think instruments like this have been helpful to kind of at least bring everyone together around an opportunity, whether there's UNGA going on or, HRC at the UN Human Rights Council, or a report that a special rapporteur is writing and everyone would like to advocate to get their issues in. So there are efforts, but I would say they're not sufficiently coordinated on their own, independently independent of whether or not there are opportunities at the moment internationally. And they're less about creating opportunities for advocacy. It's more about maybe one or two minority groups have figured out one particular instrument and everybody else would also like to be able to benefit from it. That's one thing. So no, I think there's not sufficient, preemptive coordinated efforts in creating trends, let's say like in fighting disinformation as a common denominator issue. Another thing is, I think, whether it's because the awareness beyond Tehran has increased over the years, that, oh, there is a world outside Tehran and we have to pay attention to it, whether it's because various funders, whether private or governmental, have pushed, different organizations, human rights and civil society to think beyond Tehran. Whatever the reason is, I think there is a trend of everybody who works on Iran, whether it's on human rights or civil society or political analysts, to try and think beyond Tehran and to try to challenge the Tehran-centric, capital-centric way of looking at it. And this has been, I would say, helpful in the general human rights organizations, civil society organizations, endorsing and trying to partner with various minority groups. It doesn't come without challenges. I think sometimes when you try to do good, you actually end up doing a bit of damage because of ignorance, because we have to acknowledge still we are a nation that has been deprived of transparency and information about one another for so many years, so many decades, and we suffer from ignorance. And so even the advocates, even myself, all of us, and it's a learning process. And in this we make mistakes and sometimes it's damaging, but I don't know if it's preventable. I think it's part of the process. So I see more and more human rights organizations covering the issues of the Darawish Gonabadi or the Baha'is or the Kurds or the Baluchis or the Ahwazi Arabs, the Sunnis, and so on. I think we are still at the nascent steps of both of these kinds of trends that I explained.
Great, thank you.
I want to go back to my point about much of the efforts, both by the U.S. and the EU, having been focused on security of the U.S. and its allies more than anything else, and with a specific focus on elections. And that is honestly part of the problem, because when we look at an issue like state-sponsored disinformation by a country like Iran, and we are adopting a security kind of perspective, we are falling into the trap where we may risk ignoring the importance of the human rights discourse in terms of the responses that we develop, in terms of who we speak to when we are thinking about strategies, and how we approach the implementation of those strategies and programs. And this on its own requires a lot of coordination that we currently don't see, neither between the US and the EU. Of course, there is like a transatlantic effort going on to boost initiatives and tactics that are being developed on both sides of the Atlantic, but there's much more to be done. And again, that still is not focused on the human rights aspect of it, and is mostly focused on the threats against these Western countries. And so without understanding of how these tactics are developed at home by Iran or anywhere else, we will not be able to develop strategies as comprehensively as possible. The creation of GEC inside the U.S. government is valuable, I think. However, GEC is still a relatively new agency, and although it's tasked with coordinating among the USG efforts, we are yet to see how that unfolds, and also how the civil society, academic researchers, or media can or will be involved in any sort of responses that they develop and introduce to the public. I will also say this, that when we are facing a situation that the media or social media is being populated with inaccurate information, one important move that we can make is injecting more accurate information. And the U.S. has platforms such as Radio Farda that has a good readership inside Iran, or the VOA. But I think if we are to invest more in these options, a comprehensive review of how these platforms currently function, or try to address the disinformation challenge inside Iran and against specific populations such as the minorities is required. And without that, we again may risk appropriating resources in a way that doesn't necessarily address the core issue.
Great, thank you. So, Patrick?
So in the coming days, Secretary of State Pompeo is convening an interministerial meeting to discuss the question of religious freedom. And I'd be interested in hearing your evaluation of the kind of coordination that the United States government engages in with other governments and with international agencies about particularly the disinformation aspect that we're discussing here today. What would be how would you grade the efforts of the United States government in coordinating with other governments and international organizations? And if you could make two suggestions of additional things the U.S. government might do in this regard, what would they be?
Let me begin by saying that I applaud the efforts of this administration. Contrary to the previous administration, they have been very proactive in confronting this regime and exposing them, their hands in every terrorist activity in every corner of the globe. The ministerial event is a very important and valuable event to raise awareness, but I wish that the U.S. government and others would acknowledge the simple fact that every Iranian is an oppressed religious minority or prisoner of conscience in Iran. For example, women of Iran, half the population, are the single largest oppressed group in Iran. The barbaric imposition of restrictions on them, hijab, and they have been punished severely for resisting this. Murder, rape, imprisonment, disfigurement by acid attacks. Any opposition, people like Hashem Khastar, Nasrin Sotoudeh, Qadiani, these are freedom fighters through civil discourse and peaceful means fighting this regime and the atrocities of this regime. They need to be acknowledged. When you concentrate on a specific religious minority, you divide this huge population into groups and give the regime an opportunity to divide and conquer. Oppress a specific group at a specific time, get concessions, back off, and then move to the next group, and so forth. The theme is consistent, the same. They're agents of the West, agents of foreign powers. But when you acknowledge the whole nation as an oppressed group, then they cannot label all of Iranian population as 80-some million as agents of the West. And at the same time, you send a positive reinforcing message to the Iranians that you are recognized as well, not just a specific religious minority because they have a voice outside of the country. As far as Europeans, I personally am extremely disappointed. Ms. Mogherini, who was just replaced, consistently supported, and she stated that dealing with the Islamic Republic is economic sovereignty of Europe. Or we also, Ms. Merkel repeatedly trying to send bales of cash to mullahs, ship bales of cash to mullahs at the most desperate time of their existence. And they don't think about the consequences of their actions for Iranian people. EU consistently attempts to bypass the sanctions. I hope to see them join US in this effort.
Thank you. So I believe that the Ministerial is a great initiative. It's a good start. I think There are some nuances there that sometimes get lost in translation. I think part of it is because it's a start of a conversation. My observations of the Ministerial so far has been that, especially in thinking about a country like Iran, it brings up for me the larger question that I always have is how do you help and empower and advocate for particularly marginalized communities without further politicizing their situation and therefore harming their situation even more. I don't particularly have solutions for this very $1 million question, but I think, well, one way that I'm sure it has come to the mind of the policymakers, but I would really encourage them not to let go of it, even if it's difficult to achieve, is to try and have more multilateral efforts. And so, for instance, specifically with the case of a country like Iran that has this whole anti-Western rhetorics shadowing over all of our heads for the past so many decades, perhaps partnering somehow, strategic partnerships over these kinds of issues with the global South countries. So, I don't know. I mean, for instance, imagine India and the US, or, India has its own many problems with the minority groups, but it does take pride in its diversity and multiplicity of various groups living relatively peacefully together. And I think, we need those kinds of faces a lot more at the forefront when we talk about a country like Iran. So that's one. Another observation I had there was it was more like kind of highlighting religious minorities from victims to heroes. Something in between was missing, which is the ordinary lives of citizens who are at the risk of being victims and are not yet heroes. And so I think the storytelling, the narrative around persecution as minorities, as religious minorities, is a little bit, maybe it's America-centric, maybe it's for particular consumption, I don't know, but I felt a little bit uncomfortable with that narrative sometimes. Again, I understand that it's very important to humanize and personify these stories when they have no other platform to raise these emotional, very difficult personal odysseys. But I think we should be a little bit careful with this victimhood to heroism and then kind of missing the middle ground. And another thing is, which I'm not very familiar with, but I think perception matters. The perception has been that it's a bit too Christian-oriented. I'm not sure factually if this is the case, this effort. And I think for the case of, in the Middle East, you can't deny the fact that the Christians have essentially been wiped out, unfortunately, especially ever since the Arab uprisings. But I think, again, because this perception of Western/Christian, it makes the job of working with this concerted effort more difficult. In the case of Iran, I think it further politicizes the situation of the Christians and Christian converts who are already in a very tough situation more and more every day. So these are the 3 points that I have.
Oh, yeah. Well, thank you very much for very insightful presentations. But one of the questions I had was about...
Would you please introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Barbara Heller. I'm the CEO of a company called Design and Construction Strategies. I'm a visitor.
Great.
Is privacy, the issue of invading the privacy of people. Because when you create a disinformation strategy or any kind of internet strategy, one of the ways you measure its success is by monitoring people's behavior. And actually, the United States is leading the cutting edge of this type of activity. Where do people click? Who do they buy? Who do they associate with? Who do they call? And it's another way of intruding in the lives of people you want to oppress. Does this happen in Iran, or have they not elevated themselves to that level yet?
I did the opposite thing. I think because the majority of Iranians' activities on social media happen on American social media companies, the capacity of the Iranian government in terms of how they deal with the data that they get and analyze from these platforms in order to understand how people react to their disinformation is somewhat limited. It's not non-existent, obviously, because it depends on the privacy settings of the platforms or the API of a platform like Twitter, for example. It's publicly available. Anyone with a certain level of resources can have access and start analyzing what's going on and how people interact with one another. I think part of that question should be addressed to companies to be more transparent, whether they have seen any sort of access to their data by actors that we see as adversaries, and whether they have taken any measures in terms of who and how much other actors see or have the capacity to analyze what's going on these platforms. Did I answer your questions in full? Yeah, no, you did. Yeah.
Okay. Any other question? Yes, Paula.
Thank you very much. My name is Bilal Wahab. I'm a fellow here at the Washington Institute. Hamid, you mentioned the minorities, and your two co-panelists also referred to minorities. So we have religious minorities and ethnic minorities. And yes, sometimes they're both, and therefore they get oppressed for, being an ethnic minority and a religious minority. But which one takes a priority when it comes to targeting by the regime? The ethnic part being non-Persian, or the religious part? I mean, for example, if you're an Iranian Kurd, but you're Shia, does being Shia, mild the regime's oppression of your ethnic background? Or if you're Persian, but you're Baha'i, does being Persian forgive you or tone down your Baha'ism as they refer to? I'm just wondering how the dynamic of being both. I mean, I understand that, for example, majority of the Kurds and Arabs are double Kurds. They're not Persian and they're also Sunni. But what happens when you're only one of the two and not both? Thank you.
I don't think that's an issue, and it matters to them. The issue is how much of a threat you and your ideology is to the regime. Perfect example again is Gharagozloo Sufis. They're Shia Muslims, 8 to 10 million of them. They're a big part of the population. They have had presence for centuries, millennia in Iran. But they're persecuted. They experience the same oppression as Baha'is. They have been stripped of every civil right a citizen should have. They have been education, employment, their businesses have been shut down. They have been eradicated from government and semi-governmental agencies. And their places of worship have been shut down completely. So what is the justification for it? It's because Gharagozloo Sufi's ideology and practice of Islam, specifically Shia Islam, rejects what the system preaches. So it doesn't matter if you're Sunni, if you're Shia, it doesn't matter if you're Kurdish Iranian or Arab Iranian or Baluchi. If you're a threat to the regime, then you're targeted. It's a fair game. Baha'is have a special situation because they're not categorized as people of the book, so it's more extensive. They have applied the same logic to us as infidels, blasphemous, version of Islam, American Islam, and so forth. So I don't think that's an issue. The issue is your ideology and how much of a threat you, even as an individual, are to the regime. Again, I go back to Narges Mohammadi or Nasrin Sotoudeh. There are women, they're Shia Muslim. What they stand for shakes the foundation of this regime, and they're in prison.
I will also add to that. In my research, I interviewed many high-profile Iranian activists, journalists, and pioneers of LGBT rights, and so on. And what was similar across the spectrum was that they kind of echoed the same point, that it doesn't matter who you are. The way the Iranian disinformation targets you is topic-based. For example, it seems that they have like a list of red flags such as national security, nuclear issue, the Syrian war, LGBT rights, and these are the topics that cut across social and political taboos and sensitive areas. And as soon as a piece of writing, a piece of speech, or just the very fact of being outspoken on these topics can make you a target. And you don't necessarily need to be a Baha'i to be targeted because you spoke or supported religious minorities' rights.
And also, I'm sorry, add to what my colleague said. I do think still that there is a difference between being a human rights advocate who is in prison and a minority person belonging to an ethnic group or a religious minority group. I think it's a question of targeting your collective identity and or targeting your work, your human rights work, or your personal career choices, your who you have chosen to be. And I think they intersect. There are a lot of similarities, but I think that there are differences not to undermine. And so I think, I'm not saying one is better or one is worse or whatever, but I do think that we should try and not mix all of them together for the sake of understanding what goes on in terms of both narratives and the trends of persecution. So I would really distinguish between the collective identity and the personal career, personal choices. And I also want to mention that I understand that your question is important as a researcher. I think it's a valid question to respond to. But I also think in the circumstances we are in Iran, it's a little bit of a dangerous question. It's when you fragment the identity of an individual to so many pieces and try to see which one is more of a threat to the regime. In my opinion, you fall a little bit into that narrative. Again, the question is valid. Unfortunately, the ecosystem in which we are talking about, it's a trap for this. I have worked with both religious minorities, ethnic groups, and ethnic and religious minorities, and I can tell you that you can't say which one competes with the other one in terms of how much more they suffer. I think that sometimes the issues are a little bit different. So for instance, when you look at executions, right? Like Kurds have a very high share of executions in Iran, or just in general the ethnic groups. When you look at the economic apartheid that I just explained, Baha'is really, are really pressured, but also the ethnic groups like the Kurds and the Kulbars, the people, So, there are stories that they have shared, they intersect at points, and I think that may be the actually strength of further coordinated efforts. But I think, I choose not to try to give them score based on the intensity and the less, just because of the circumstances, because of the kind of the government and state we deal with.
Okay. More question? Okay. Let me thank our panelists. Thank you very much for your great presentation and contribution. And thank all of you for attending this event.
Thank you.